Nobody at Branch 256 of the Royal Canadian Legion knew very much about Stanley Moorcraft, and Stanley Moorcraft preferred it that way. He was 74 years old, with the kind of face that had earned its lines honestly, deep-set creases around the eyes, a jaw that had grown soft with age but still carried a certain set to it, like a door that had been closed firmly one too many times and never quite swung loose again. He wore the same thing every Wednesday: grey work trousers, a blue plaid flannel shirt washed so many times the pattern had faded nearly to suggestion, and a canvas field jacket the colour of old pine bark that might have been issued by the Canadian Forces 30 years ago or bought at Value Village last spring. Nobody had asked. He arrived at 1:30 on the dot, paid his range fee in exact change, signed the log in a steady, unhurried hand, and carried his own hearing protection in a small canvas bag, alongside a thermos of black coffee he never offered to share. He was not unfriendly. He nodded. He held doors. Once he had helped a teenager re-zero a scope without being asked, speaking 3 quiet sentences that fixed in 20 minutes what the kid had struggled with for 3 visits. But he never talked about himself, never lingered after his rounds were done, and if anyone asked where he'd learned to shoot like that, he would say only, "I used to do a bit of this for work," and leave it there. The other regulars had made their peace with his mystery. They called him Stan when they called him anything, and mostly they let him be. That particular Wednesday in late September was not like the others. The Ottawa Valley Precision Challenge had drawn competitors from across eastern Ontario and parts of western Quebec, serious shooters, the kind who drove 2 hours for a chance to see their name on a scoreboard. The range at Branch 256 had been swept and organised for the occasion, targets set at 500 metres across the open field behind the building, the old maple trees at the far treline burning orange and red against a sky the colour of cold water. It was a beautiful day for it, and everyone knew it. Spencer Vanek arrived the way he always arrived, loudly. He was 27 years old, built like someone who owned several gym memberships and used all of them with the easy confidence of a man who had not yet been seriously wrong about anything. He had 340,000 followers on Instagram. His rifle, a custom-built precision bolt-action his sponsoring company had assembled specifically for him, carried a price tag most Branch 256 members would not have said out loud in polite company. He had a coach, a man named Adrian, who wore polarized shooting glasses indoors and spoke in the clipped cadence of someone who had watched a very great many tutorial videos. He had a girlfriend with a gimbal-stabilized camera that had not been put down since they'd pulled into the parking lot. He had 2 friends whose primary function seemed to be laughing at his jokes and confirming, repeatedly, that yes, he really was that good. The range record Spencer kept mentioning had stood for 11 years. 500 metres, 10 shots, a grouping tight enough to cover with a loonie. It had been set by a marksmanship instructor out of CFB Petawawa using a standard issue C3A1. No modifications, no custom trigger, just clean technique and what the instructor later described, modestly, as a very agreeable wind. Spencer had been chasing that record for 8 months. He had come close twice. Close was not the same as done, and Spencer Vanek was not accustomed to things remaining undone. "Today's the day," he told his girlfriend, who nodded and zoomed in on his face for a reaction shot. Stanley arrived at 1:30 as always, while Spencer's entourage was still arranging their equipment across 3 lanes. He signed the log, Stanley R. Moorcraft, paid his fee, and asked Kayla, the range officer, a 22-year-old Algonquin college student who volunteered on competition days, whether the branch's old Remington 700 was available. Kayla blinked. "The loaner, the .308? That's the one. It's available, but most people today want the newer rifles. There are some really nice setups for the competition." Stanley smiled, which was a small thing on his face but genuine. "The Remington's fine." She brought it out, and something about the way the old man accepted it made her pause in spite of herself. He ran his hands along the stock without looking at it, checking the action the way you might check a handshake. Not suspicious, just thorough, out of long habit. She would think about that moment later. She would think about it quite often. Spencer's warm-up rounds were genuinely impressive, and you should know that. There is nothing dishonest about acknowledging that Spencer Vanek could shoot. He had put in the hours, had the gift for stillness that marks real talent, and his custom rifle rewarded clean technique generously. His first 3 shots at 500 meters formed a triangle a practiced eye would admire. His coach Adrian called corrections in a low voice. His girlfriend filmed. His friends murmured approval. At some point during Spencer's 4th shot, he glanced down the row of lanes and saw the old man in the faded jacket settling in at lane 8, furthest from the crowd, with the battered Remington. "Good luck with that, old-timer," Spencer said, not unkindly, just reflexively, the way a person says something they don't quite think before saying. His friends laughed. Stanley didn't respond. He was already settling into position. But the record was the record, and the record required something Spencer had not yet found. The bone-deep quiet of a person who has already decided what matters, who carries nothing to the mat that doesn't belong there. That quality cannot be purchased with sponsorship money. It cannot be accumulated with repetitions. It has to be arrived at by a longer road than competition can provide. Stanley adjusted his position once, twice, and then became very still. People who happened to glance his way during those few minutes would later struggle to describe what they saw. Not tension, not focus exactly, more like the absence of anything unnecessary, like a room where everything that doesn't belong has already been removed, quietly, without fuss, long before anyone arrived. He fired his first shot. The electronic target display registered a hit at 500 meters, dead center. Kayla looked at the display, then at the old man. He had not moved. He was already settling for the second shot, making adjustments that existed more in muscle memory than in conscious thought, his breathing slow, and even as a sleeping child's. The second shot struck so close to the first that the system flagged an error, a double registration, the software uncertain how to record 2 holes that occupied nearly the same coordinates on the target face. Kayla stood up from her chair. One of Spencer's friends had noticed. "Lucky shot," he said, but he didn't look away. By the 4th shot, Adrian had stopped speaking. By the 6th, the entire range had gone quiet in the way that large groups of people sometimes go quiet, not because anyone organized it, but because something was happening that noise felt inappropriate to interrupt. Spencer set his expensive rifle down on the mat and walked toward lane 8, with his arms loose at his sides, his face wearing an expression he probably didn't know he was making. The look of a young person encountering, for the first time, something genuinely outside their frame of reference. Stanley fired his 7th shot, his 8th. His expression did not change, his hands did not shake. There was a quality to his shooting that had nothing to do with talent, or even with skill in the ordinary sense. It was more like watching someone pray quietly in a language they had spoken since childhood, entirely private, entirely complete. The 10th shot landed. The grouping measured 38 millimeters across at 500 meters. The old record, 11 years standing, was gone. For a long moment, nobody said anything. Then Bert Ashford said something. Bert was 78 years old, a former warrant officer who had served with the Royal Canadian Regiment and come home from his deployments with a slight tremor in his left hand and a complete unwillingness to discuss certain years of his life. He had volunteered at Branch 256 for over 2 decades and knew most things there were to know about most people who came through. He had been watching from the doorway since the 5th shot, standing very still himself for different reasons. Now he was looking at the sign-in log Kayla had left open on the counter, and the colour had gone out of his face entirely. "Stanley Moorcraft," he said. His voice was not quite steady. "You're Stanley Moorcraft." The name didn't land for most people in the room. But for Bert and for Edgar Colhoun, a retired master corporal who had spent 12 years in the PPCLI and was not given to dramatic statements, it landed like something dropped from a very considerable height. "Oh Lord," Edgar said quietly, "you're the Ghost of Kandahar." Stanley had set the Remington down with the careful reverence he always showed borrowed things. He looked at Bert for a long moment. He didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. There are names that circulate in military communities the way certain stories circulate in families, passed down, worn smooth at the edges with retelling, the centre always true. The Ghost of Kandahar was one of those names. In the autumn of 2006, during some of the most brutal urban fighting Canadian forces had experienced since Korea, a 4-man JTF-2 element had held a rooftop position in Kandahar city for 38 hours without relief. They had been covering the extraction of 17 wounded soldiers. soldiers who would otherwise have been overrun before the morning. The fighting had been, by the accounts of the men and women who survived it, something that language struggles to fully contain. The operator who had directed fire from that rooftop through the night and into the second morning, who had been wounded twice and declined medical evacuation until every last soldier was confirmed clear, had received the Star of Military Valor in a private ceremony, shaken the Governor-General's hand, and disappeared from public life entirely. No interviews, no book, no speeches, nothing. People said he'd moved to British Columbia. Some said he'd died overseas years later. Nobody had thought to check the sign-in log at a Legion range in the Ottawa Valley. "I asked for the quiet branch," Stanley said simply. He wasn't apologizing, he was just explaining. Spencer was still standing at the edge of Lane 8. All the easy confidence had left his face, replaced by something rawer, a confusion that, if it was given room to grow, might become something finer. He looked at the man he had called old-timer, in the reflex where someone who does not yet know what he doesn't know. He looked at the borrowed Remington that had just unmade 11 years of history. He looked at his own custom rifle, lying on its mat, and for the first time in his competitive life, it seemed very small. "Sir," Spencer said, his voice had changed, "I owe you an apology." Stanley looked at him with the same measured gravity he brought to everything. "You didn't know," he said. "You weren't rude to Stanley Moorcraft. You were rude to a stranger older than yourself, which is a different thing, but not a thing I'd encourage, either way." Spencer opened his mouth, closed it, and nodded. There was no performance in it, just a young man doing the quiet work of recalibrating. Word moved through the veteran community the way it always moves, through texts, phone calls, and the particular networks of people who have served together, which require no algorithm and travel faster than any of them. Within the hour, Branch 256 had filled in a way it hadn't since Remembrance Day. A retired lieutenant colonel named Constance Webb arrived in a business suit, her Legion poppy pinned neatly to her lapel. She had been the operations officer the night of the Kandahar extraction. She had written Stanley's Star of Military Valor citation herself, in a forward operating base with mortar fire, landing close enough to rattle the table she was writing on. When she walked into the branch and saw him standing quietly by Lane 8, she stopped walking for a moment. "Sergeant Moorcraft," she said. "Ma'am," he replied, and there was a history in those two syllables that everyone in the room felt without needing to understand. "My husband is alive because of what your team did on that rooftop," she said. Her voice was level. She had practiced evenness for a long time. "He's a civil engineer now. He coaches his kids' hockey team on Saturday mornings in Ottawa. He has a whole life because of the hours you spent up there." Stanley stood quietly with this, the way he stood quietly with most things. "I'm glad he made it home," he said. "I'm glad they all made it home." A young corporal, barely 23, fresh from his last deployment, asked to shake Stanley's hand with the careful reverence of someone meeting. Something they'd believed was only legend. Vera Szymanski, who had served as a medic during the extraction and now worked at the Civic Hospital in Ottawa, told the room what she had seen when she finally reached the rooftop after the mission was declared clear. "He was still at his position," she said. "They told him it was done, the soldiers were out, it was over. And he said, 'Give me another 30 minutes. Make sure the perimeter is clean before you move anyone.'" She shook her head. "He didn't stop until he was certain. Certain in a way that the rest of us weren't sure was even possible." Stanley listened to her tell this, as a man listens to a description of weather he remembers differently than she does. "I did what needed doing," he said, "same as everyone who was there." Bert Ashford, who had been holding himself together with the discipline of many years of practice, was not holding it anymore. He sat down in one of the Legion chairs and pressed both hands together and looked at the floor for a while. Rupert Haynes, the branch president, a former chief petty officer with 30 years in the Royal Canadian Navy who was not easily surprised by anything, came out of his office, looked at the gathering, looked at Stanley, and arrived at a decision. "We're naming the range," he said. "It was not a proposal, Moorcraft Range, and that record goes on a plaque that stays on this wall as long as this branch stands." Stanley started to object. Rupert cut him off with the authority of a man accustomed to being heard over engine noise. "You've been coming here every Wednesday for 3 years, Rupert said. "Paying your fees, keeping to yourself, never asking for anything. You let people not know who you were, and you didn't make them feel small for their not knowing. That's its own kind of service, Stan. We're seeing it now. We're going to make sure everyone who comes through that door after us sees it too. They mounted the plaque that evening, brass screwed to the cedar panelling beside Lane 8, Stanley R. Moorcraft MCPL Ret JTF2, Star of Military Valor, Kandahar City 2006, range record, unbroken. The gathering ran longer than anyone had planned. People shared stories the way veterans share them, which is to say, carefully at first and then all at once. Some had served beside Stanley, others had served beside the men he'd protected, or heard their fathers speak of it, or read the sanitized version in a training document that never mentioned a name. A retired signals officer described hearing the radio traffic from that rooftop and thinking the man at the other end was certainly already dead. He sounded like he was doing paperwork, the officer said, like it was just another morning. Stanley listened to all of it with the expression of a man who has made peace. Mostly, with the distance between what happened and what can be said about what happened. It was Spencer who finally broke the quiet that had settled back over the room. He had stayed long after his coach had left, long after his girlfriend had put the camera away, standing near the doorway in the way of someone who has no clean reason to leave but knows they haven't yet earned a full place in the room. When he spoke, he was careful. "Sir," he said, addressing Stanley directly, "I've been trying to understand something since I watched you shoot today. I've been competing for 6 years. I have the right equipment, I have good coaching, and I'm not a humble person, so I'll tell you honestly, I'm very good. But what I saw in Lane 8 today, that wasn't technique. That wasn't even skill, the way I understand skill. What was that?" The room listened. Stanley picked up his empty thermos, found it empty, set it back down. "My daughter used to drive me here," he said. "Every Wednesday. She'd drop me off, go run her errands, come back. She didn't shoot. She just thought I needed to get out of the house and be somewhere that wasn't home." He paused. "She passed 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. We had 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. 8 weeks." The room did not move. "After she was gone, I kept coming here on Wednesdays. I don't entirely know why. Maybe because it was the last part of my week that still had her shape in it. The drive over, the coffee, this place, the drive back." He looked at the plaque for a moment. "The first few months after, I couldn't shoot well at all. Hands wouldn't settle. The quiet wouldn't come. I'd get to the mat and everything in me was noise." He looked at Spencer steady, unhurried. "And then one afternoon I realized I could hear her. She had a way of saying something to me when I got like that, restless, which I used to get and still get. She'd say, 'Be still, Dad. Just be still.' The way you say something you've said many times but haven't lost patience with." He was quiet for a moment. "I started hearing it here at the mat, and things would go quiet." He leaned forward slightly. "The difference between a good shot and a true one has nothing to do with the rifle, and nothing to do with the equipment. It has to do with what you carry into the moment. The competition, the record, the followers, the brand deal. You bring all of that up to the mat, and it makes noise in your hands. You have to set it down first before you can find the stillness. And to set it down, you have to have something that matters more than the outcome." He paused. "A deal mattered more than the outcome. She still does. When I settle into Lane 8, I'm not there for a record. I'm just being still because she asked me to be. That's all." Spencer's eyes were bright. He held very still, which was something. "Would you? I know I have no right to ask, but would you be willing to let me try to learn that? Not the technique. I understand now the technique isn't what I'm missing. Just the way you approach it." Stanley studied him for a long moment with the patience of a man who has learned that most things worth knowing take longer to become clear than we expect. "There's a veterans peer support group I help facilitate on Thursday evenings at the community centre on Murray Street," he said. "Men and women who came home from hard places and are still learning how to be quiet, how to set down what they carry long enough to find some rest. Noise in the hands, noise in the mind, it's the same problem. If you genuinely want to understand what stillness is made of, come Thursday. Not to watch, to help." Spencer didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir, I'll be there." "Bring your sister," Rupert added from across the room, and Spencer looked up, surprised. "Word had moved the way it does." Rupert smiled slightly. "We heard she's been wanting to learn for 2 years. 17 years old, from what I understand, and better natural form than her brother. Spencer laughed, a short, genuine laugh with no performance in it. That's more than fair. The branch emptied slowly as the October evening came down. People left different than they'd arrived, in the quiet way that real things change a person. Not dramatically, not all at once, but at some load-bearing level they wouldn't find the words for until weeks later. Kayla asked Stanley whether he'd speak with her journalism professor about a project on unrecognised veterans. Rupert announced that the day's competition proceeds would seed a bursary for children of Canadian Forces members killed in service. Constance Webb promised to bring her husband the following Wednesday so he could put a face, finally, to the name that had been part of their family's private history for 20 years. By 8 o'clock, only Stanley and Bert were left. They sat together beside Lane 8, with a pot of tea between them that the last volunteer had made before locking up. The dark had come down, and the maple trees outside were shapes against a deeper dark. Neither of them spoke very much, and it was enough. "You okay, Stan?" Bert asked finally. Stanley looked at the plaque for a while. "She used to say I was hiding out here," he said at last, "that I used this range the way some men use a garage, just to have somewhere to go that felt like mine, where nobody asked much of me." He turned the thermos in his hands. She wasn't wrong. "You're not hiding tonight," Bert said. "No," he looked at the plaque again. The brass was new and bright under the range lights. "No, tonight I'm not." She'd be proud of you. She'd tell me it took me long enough. He almost smiled, and it reached his eyes. She had very little patience for unnecessary delays. She got that from her mother. Bert laughed, and the sound of it broke something loose in the room that had needed breaking, and they drank their tea and said almost nothing more, and it was entirely enough. The following Wednesday, Stanley arrived at 1:30 as always. But there was a line outside Lane 8. Spencer was first, and beside him stood a girl with serious eyes and an old canvas rifle bag she'd borrowed from somewhere. His sister, who had asked to be taught for 2 years and had not until now been taken seriously by the men in her orbit. Behind them were 3 younger men who'd heard what had happened through a friend who'd been at the branch that Tuesday evening and hadn't been able to stop talking about it. Behind them, a woman in her 40s who had been rebuilding a steadiness in herself after a long illness, and had been told by someone who'd heard from someone who was there that this was the place and this was the man. Stanley looked at them all for a moment. He picked up the borrowed Remington, because the Remington was always what he chose, and settled it across both hands. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's talk about stillness. Let's talk about what you're carrying and what you might be willing to set down. And then let's talk about what it is you're actually protecting." He turned to Spencer's sister, who was watching him with an attention that reminded him, sharply and sweetly, of Adele. "We'll begin with you," he said. "What's your name?" She straightened slightly. Simone Vanek." "Simone," he said. "Good. Pay attention to your hands. Not to what they're doing, to what they're not doing. That's where everything begins." And in Lane 8 of the Moorcraft range, under a plaque that would carry his name, long after all the people in that room had gone their separate ways, an old soldier in a faded canvas jacket began the only kind of mission that had ever truly felt finished. Not in the field, not in the citations, not in the silence he had kept for 30 years, but here in the teaching, in the patient giving away of something that could not be bought or filmed or measured in millimeters. Only carried, only given, only kept alive in the giving. That is how it has always been with the best of what people carry home.